Summer 1943. Thousands of German soldiers captured in North Africa arrived in America on Liberty ships. Exhausted, demoralized, they expected hard labor, hunger, maybe even mistreatment. Instead, when they reached the camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, they found something strange. Alongside barbed wire and barracks stood buildings with chalkboards, desks, and even shelves of books. At first, they assumed these were for guards or American soldiers. But within weeks, notices appeared in German on camp bulletin boards. Classes available. Enroll freely. One prisoner remembered, "We thought it was a joke." School? For prisoners? We had prepared for punishment, not education, the guards explained calmly. Any prisoner who wished could study. English, mathematics, history, even science. The courses were taught by German-speaking Americans, chaplains, or in some cases, by the prisoners themselves. The Germans stared in disbelief. Back home, schools lay in ruins. Universities were stripped of professors, many silenced or killed. Yet here, in captivity, the enemy offered what the Reich was destroying: knowledge. Soon the classrooms filled. Men sat on benches with pencils and notebooks, listening as lessons began. Guards watched curiously, amused to see hardened Afrika Korps veterans hunched over spelling exercises. A diary recorded the surreal moment. "Yesterday, I carried hay bales on a farm. Today, I sat at a desk writing English words on paper. War is madness, and captivity is stranger still." Classes range from basic reading to advanced philosophy. Some camps even offered lessons in American civics, explaining democracy to men raised under dictatorship. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. One prisoner whispered to another, "We fight against this system, and yet here we sit, studying it." His comrade nodded in silence. For many, it was the first time in years they had touched a book. In Germany, paper was rationed, libraries bombed, and knowledge censored. Here, in the land of the enemy, they were suddenly surrounded by learning. The shock was overwhelming. They had expected barbed wire to confine them. Instead, it opened doors to classrooms, chalkboards, and ideas they had never been allowed to explore. One veteran later wrote, "America gave me back what the Reich had taken: education. Behind the wire, I discovered freedom of the mind, and this was only the beginning." The first classes began quietly. Notices on bulletin boards listed schedules. English at 9 a.m., mathematics at 2 p.m., history in the evenings. Few prisoners signed up at first, suspicious of American motives, but curiosity won out. On a warm morning in Texas, 30 men shuffled into a makeshift classroom, an old barracks cleared of bunks, with rows of desks built from scrap wood. At the front stood an American chaplain holding chalk. "Good morning," he said in slow, careful German. "Today, we will begin with English." The prisoners exchanged wary looks, but notebooks opened. The lesson began. They started with simple words: bread, water, house, road. The chaplain spoke. The men repeated, their accents thick but eager. Some laughed nervously at their mistakes. Others scribbled furiously, determined to learn. One diary described the moment. "I have fought in deserts and mountains, yet I was more nervous repeating the word apple than facing Montgomery's guns. Strange to feel like a child again." By afternoon, more prisoners signed up. Word spread quickly. There were real lessons, with books and paper, not propaganda. Soon, classrooms overflowed, with men sitting on floors to hear. Mathematics followed. Equations filled chalkboards. Formulas whispered back and forth. Some men, once university students before the war, rediscovered long-forgotten skills. Others stared blankly, but tried anyway, savoring the distraction. In the evenings, history classes drew crowds. American instructors explained their revolution, their constitution, their ideals. The Germans listened in silence, stunned that their enemy was teaching them not hatred, but ideas. A guard later remarked, "They come willingly. No one forces them. They sit for hours, hungry for knowledge. These are not soldiers, now they are students." Even skeptics began to join. Some who had sworn never to learn the enemy's tongue now stumbled through English sentences, surprising even themselves. One prisoner recorded, "It is a strange thing. We are at war, yet the Americans teach us like schoolboys. They are not trying to humiliate us, but to open our minds. This is more dangerous to the Reich than bullets." Within weeks, the classes became routine. Prisoners rose early, worked in the fields, then hurried back to their classrooms. The camp, once only barbed wire and boredom, now buzzed with the energy of learning. And the Germans soon realized this was not temporary. The Americans were serious. Education was not a trick, but a program designed to last. For the first time in captivity, the men felt something unexpected: purpose. As the weeks passed, the Americans realized something remarkable. Many of the German prisoners had once been students, teachers, even professors before the war. Historians, engineers, musicians, mathematicians, men who had traded chalkboards for rifles, now sat restlessly behind barbed wire. The Americans saw potential and quietly encouraged them to teach. Soon, camp bulletins listed new courses, not taught by guards, but by fellow prisoners. Introduction to Physics, German Literature, Engineering Design. Names of instructors appeared beside each class. A diary noted, "Today our teacher was not an American, but Oberleutnant Kruger, once a university lecturer in Berlin. He drew equations across the board until our heads spun. For a moment we forgot the wire in another camp. A captured architect taught drawing and design. His classroom filled with young soldiers eager to learn skills for a future they could not yet imagine." The camps transformed into strange universities. Men marched from roll call to lessons, carrying notebooks instead of rifles. In the evenings, discussions lingered over philosophy, literature, and politics. One American chaplain remarked, "I walked into a barracks expecting silence. Instead, I found a debate over Goethe and Schiller. They were prisoners, yes, but also scholars, the prisoners, starved of knowledge under years of Nazi censorship, devoured books. Some studied English to write letters more fluently. Others discovered Shakespeare, Dickens, or American history for the first time. A young prisoner wrote, 'I had not read freely since 1933. In this camp, behind a wire, I held books banned by the Reich. I felt freer in captivity than at home.' The classes gave the men dignity. They were no longer only prisoners, they were students, apprentices, thinkers. Birthdays and work details marked the calendar. But it was education that gave their days meaning. Even guards began to respect them differently. Reports mentioned the university atmosphere spreading through certain camps, where lectures replaced quarrels and lessons eased tension. For the Germans, the greatest shock was not the barbed wire, nor the rations, nor the endless work. It was this, that the enemy offered them not just survival, but education. And soon the Americans would take it further, arranging for actual universities to extend courses inside the camps, giving prisoners certificates for their studies. For German POWs, it was almost unthinkable, yet it was real. By late 1944, the education programs in the POW camps had grown beyond notebooks and chalkboards. Word spread that American universities themselves were becoming involved. Professors from nearby colleges volunteered to lecture inside the wire. They carried stacks of books, prepared syllabi, and treated the Germans not as enemies but as students. One diary recorded the shock. Today, a professor from Baylor University lectured us on American history. I sat at a desk in captivity, listening to a real scholar. It felt impossible, like stepping into another world. Some camps established full partnerships with universities. Correspondence courses were introduced. Prisoners could submit essays, take exams, and in some cases earn certificates stamped with the seal of an American institution. The Germans stared at these papers in disbelief. A document from a U.S. college awarded not to a citizen but to a prisoner, it was proof that the enemy valued knowledge above vengeance. A chaplain explained the philosophy: if you return home educated, you will not fight another war. Knowledge is the strongest weapon we can give you. The prisoners debated this endlessly. Some argued it was propaganda. Others insisted it was genuine. But few could deny the hunger for learning that spread through the camps. One guard noted in his report, "They crowd into classrooms every evening. Even those who once refused now sit in the back, listening. The schoolhouse is more crowded than the mess hall. The subjects expanded: economics, literature, engineering, even philosophy. Men who once commanded tanks now struggled through Shakespeare's sonnets or algebraic proofs. The irony was sharp. In Germany, universities lay in ruins, libraries burned, and professors silenced. Here, in enemy hands, the pursuit of knowledge was alive. A young soldier scribbled in his diary, "The Reich gave me orders. America gave me books. I am beginning to wonder which is the true prison." The Americans believed education was re-education, showing the prisoners a different world, a society built not on fear, but on freedom and learning. The Germans felt the impact. For the first time in years, they were not only surviving, but growing. Captivity had become a classroom, and the barbed wire a paradoxical gateway to knowledge. And soon, the greatest shock came not just in attending classes, but in realizing that some prisoners would carry American education home with them, shaping the future of post-war Germany. Not every prisoner could enroll in American-run courses. Space was limited, books were scarce, and professors could not reach every camp. But the hunger for learning was unstoppable, so the prisoners turned to their own. Former teachers, engineers, and scholars captured in the deserts of Africa or the fields of Europe stepped forward to share their knowledge. One barracks transformed into a lecture hall where a former Berlin mathematician sketched equations across a chalkboard scavenged from an abandoned schoolhouse. Another hut became a language lab, with a teacher drilling English verbs into tired soldiers. A diary recorded, "I sat in class taught by Oberfeldwebel Schneider, once a professor of history. His lecture on the French Revolution was better than any I had heard at university. For 3 hours, I forgot the wire." The system grew. Camps developed full schedules with timetables pinned to walls like university course listings. Mornings were for farm work, afternoons for lectures, evenings for debate circles. One American guard noted, "The camp feels less like a prison than a school." They file into class with pencils like students. Even the hard men soften when given books. Subjects range from practical skills mechanics, agriculture, carpentry, to the abstract, like philosophy and poetry. Some men even studied law, preparing for futures they might never have imagined before captivity. The prisoners printed their own notebooks, stitched together from scraps of paper. Margins filled with equations, translations, and sketches became secret treasures they carried home after the war. A young soldier confessed in his diary, "I came here as a tank driver. I will leave as a student. Perhaps this is the strangest victory of all. The Americans quietly supported this system, supplying books through the YMCA and allowing prisoners to build libraries from donated volumes. Guards who once watched for escape attempts now watched men argue over Goethe and Kant. Soon, some camps reported over half their prisoners enrolled in classes. The thirst for learning was stronger than any discipline imposed by guards. And for the men themselves, the shock was deep. Captivity had given them back the universities that their own homeland had destroyed. In barbed wire schools, Germany's future professors, engineers, and leaders were being remade by the very enemy they had once sworn to destroy. And soon this paradox would only deepen when American newspapers began reporting that German prisoners were leaving the camps better educated than many citizens. As the camp education programs grew, news began to spread beyond the fences. American newspapers reported, almost with disbelief, that German prisoners were attending college classes while the war still raged. Headlines read, "Nazi POWs study Shakespeare in Texas," and "Enemy soldiers learn English in our schools." Some articles praised the effort, calling it a humane experiment. Others criticized it sharply. One editorial fumed, "Our boys die overseas while their enemies sit in classrooms with books in hand. Is this justice?" Yet many educators defended the program. College presidents and professors argued that re-education was essential. If these men returned home with knowledge instead of hatred, perhaps the seeds of another war could be avoided. A professor wrote in a letter to the editor, "The greatest weapon we can wield is not the rifle, but the book. To teach a prisoner democracy is to defeat Nazism at its root." Inside the camps, the Germans were astonished to learn they were appearing in American newspapers. Guards teased them, waving clippings at work details. "Look," they laughed, "you're famous." One diary captured the irony. "We are written about as though we are curiosities. They cannot understand why their enemy loves to study. But perhaps it is because they do not know how much knowledge we lost at home." Some Americans worried that POWs were being treated too well, but farmers who relied on their labor defended the programs. Educated men worked harder, caused fewer problems, and kept morale steady. Prison officials noted the same. A report from 1944 read, "Education has reduced unrest. Where classes are held, discipline is easier. The men are occupied, their minds calmer." The paradox fascinated Americans. Their sons bled in Europe and the Pacific, yet in their own backyard, German soldiers sat in classrooms, reading books, quoting poetry, and solving equations. For the prisoners, the attention was strange, but the shock was deeper. The enemy was not ashamed of giving them knowledge. Instead, Americans were proud of it, even when their own citizens questioned the choice. A prisoner later reflected, "We thought they would hate us. Instead, they gave us books." The Americans saw no contradiction in this. That was the greatest surprise of all, and soon the education would reach even greater heights when German prisoners began leaving captivity with certificates, diplomas, and even credits recognized by universities back in Germany. What began as chalk on a blackboard was about to shape the rebuilding of an entire nation. By 1945, the education programs inside POW camps had grown far beyond simple English lessons. What began as chalk and borrowed books evolved into full courses, with exams, essays, and recognized qualifications. Several American universities partnered with the War Department to issue certificates of study. Prisoners who passed exams in mathematics, literature, or engineering left camp not only with memories but with diplomas in hand. A diary entry captured the astonishment. "Today I was given a certificate stamped with the seal of an American college. I am a prisoner of war, yet I carry a diploma from my enemy. Such a thing is unthinkable in Germany. Some camps even established official libraries stocked with thousands of donated volumes. Men could check out textbooks, novels, and histories freely, within the fences of captivity. One American administrator noted, "Many prisoners study harder than our own students. They believe education is the only freedom they can grasp behind wire exams were conducted with strict discipline. Papers were graded, essays corrected, marks recorded. A few prisoners earned enough credit to later transfer directly into German universities once repatriated. For many, this was more shocking than the food or the humane treatment. The Americans were not just feeding their bodies, they were investing in their futures." A guard described the moment he handed a prisoner his diploma. He stared at it in silence, then said, "I will show this to my children." It was the first time I saw him smile without bitterness. The irony was sharp. In Germany, universities had been gutted by war and ideology. Professors silenced, books burned, degrees tainted by politics. Yet here, in enemy hands, education flourished. One prisoner wrote, "The Reich gave me a rifle. America gave me a diploma. I wonder which will last longer." For the Americans, it was re-education, a way to reshape future Germany. For the prisoners, it was survival of the spirit. Knowledge became a form of freedom. And soon these men would return home not only as veterans of war, but as unexpected alumni of America's classrooms behind barbed wire. What they carried with them would change their lives and, in small ways, the destiny of their homeland. By late 1945 and into 1946, the camps began to empty. The war was over. One by one, German prisoners boarded ships to cross the Atlantic, not as soldiers, but as men changed by captivity. When they stepped onto German soil, the shock was immediate. Cities lay in ruins, factories silent, streets filled with rubble. Families lived in basements, scraping for food. Universities were bombed out shells. One prisoner wrote, "I came home with books in my bag and knowledge in my head." But my old university was gone. The library was ashes. The professors, scattered or dead for many, their American education became both a blessing and a burden. They carried notebooks filled with English words, math equations, and essays, but no classrooms in which to continue. Still, some found ways to rebuild. Former POWs who had studied engineering helped repair bridges. Those who had learned agriculture techniques applied them in shattered farmlands. Others taught English to neighbors eager for new opportunities. A farmer's son recalled years later, "My father came back from America with a certificate and a dictionary. He taught himself, then taught us. He said the Americans gave him more than food, they gave him a future." Not everyone welcomed their stories. Some Germans, bitter in defeat, accused the returning men of being softened by American propaganda. But the former prisoners knew better. The education they received was not weakness, it was survival. One veteran defended himself. "They gave us books, not chains. If knowledge is propaganda, then let me be guilty of it." Slowly, as Germany began to rebuild, these men became part of a new foundation. Teachers, engineers, translators' roles, shaped not only by their homeland, but by classrooms behind barbed wire in America. American officials had hoped for this. They believed educated prisoners would return as leaders, not fanatics, and in many cases they were right. A historian later wrote, "The seeds of West Germany's democratic rebirth were planted not only in occupied zones, but in prison camp classrooms thousands of miles away." For the prisoners themselves, the memory was personal. They had gone to war to destroy a world. They returned with lessons that helped build a new one. And all of it began with the shock of sitting at a desk, pencil in hand, under the watch of a guard who treated them as students instead of enemies. It was a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. The war ended, but the lessons did not. For many former POWs, the notebooks, certificates, and scraps of paper carried home from America became the foundation of new lives. Some became teachers, opening classrooms in ruined towns. Others worked as engineers, using techniques learned in POW lectures to rebuild bridges and factories. A few even became university professors, shaping the next generation of German students. One veteran recalled, "I sat in a prison barracks and learned English words. 20 years later, I taught English at a school in Munich. My students never believed where I learned it." The influence stretched into families. Children grew up hearing their fathers speak English phrases, describe American professors, and tell stories of studying Shakespeare or mathematics in captivity. For many of these children, their fathers' experiences became the first window into a wider world beyond post-war Germany's ruins. Some were inspired to study abroad, even in the very country where their fathers had once been prisoners. Historians later traced a surprising number of German educators and civic leaders back to POW camps in the United States. The so-called barbed wire universities had shaped men who would guide Germany's democratic future. One diary put it simply, "I went to war as a soldier. I returned as a student. That was the Americans' greatest victory over me." Not every prisoner embraced the lessons. Some rejected them, clinging to old ideologies. But for thousands, the education became a turning point, a chance to remake themselves in a way the Reich had never allowed. American officials who once faced criticism for spoiling the enemy now saw results. Reports from occupied Germany confirmed that educated returnees were less hostile, more cooperative, and eager to rebuild. One U.S. officer wrote, "We feared these men would return as hardened enemies. Instead, many returned as teachers. Our classrooms had done more than our rifles ever could." For the prisoners of war, the shock had turned into gratitude. Even decades later, they spoke of their time in American classrooms with awe, sometimes even with affection for the guards and professors who had given them knowledge. A veteran reflected late in life, "America gave me no freedom of movement, but it gave me freedom of the mind. That freedom has stayed with me all my life." The lessons learned behind barbed wire had crossed oceans and generations. They had turned prisoners of war into builders of peace. And soon, historians would call it one of the strangest paradoxes of World War II. Men captured in battle, educated in captivity, and returned home as students of democracy. Decades after the war, the story of German POWs in America remained little known. Most people remembered the battles, the bombings, the camps. Few remembered the classrooms behind barbed wire. But for the men who lived it, those classrooms were the most unforgettable part of captivity. They had come as enemies, expecting only punishment. Instead, they left with knowledge, books, and in some cases, diplomas. One former prisoner said in an interview, "I did not expect kindness from my captors. I expected chains. Instead, they gave me a pencil and paper. That pencil built my future." Historians later called the program a quiet revolution. While rifles and tanks won the war on battlefields, books and chalkboards helped win the peace. The men who had studied Shakespeare, American civics, or engineering inside U.S. camps carried those lessons into their homes, their professions, and even into the rebuilding of their shattered nation. A veteran's son once recalled, "My father spoke more often of his classes in captivity than of his battles. He said the Americans defeated him with education, not weapons. For the Americans, the strategy had worked. Education was re-education. By giving prisoners tools for the future, they ensured many would not return to the ideologies of the past. And for the Germans, the shock of being taught by their enemy turned into respect, and in some cases, admiration. They had discovered that freedom of the mind could exist even behind fences. One diary summed it up. I was a prisoner of war, but in America, I became free in a way I had never known in Germany. The legacy of these barbed wire universities outlived the camps themselves. They became proof that compassion and knowledge could be stronger than hate, even in a world at war. German POWs were shocked to attend college classes in U.S. camps. But in that shock, they found more than surprise. They found possibility, dignity, and the seeds of a future their captors hoped would grow into peace. And in many ways it did. Across Germany, across families, across generations, the lessons carried home from captivity shaped a quieter, lasting victory, one written not in blood, but in ink. A legacy of knowledge, born behind barbed wire, remembered long after the guns went silent. The war had ended, but the education endured,